In this video, I'm going to talk about Confucianism, and we're going to start with discussing the Analects, which is a work attributed to the Chinese philosopher known in the West often as Confucius. Now, that's a Latinization of his name. It's perhaps more accurate transliteration if we're using the pinyin system to refer to him as Kongzi. Again, I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly at all. Different transliteration systems you might call him Kung Futsa or Master Kung. Again, my apologies on the butchery of the language here, which I'll probably continue to do. So Confucius, as I'll refer to him, lived probably from 551 to 479 BCE, and this is just before the so-called Warring States period of Chinese history. It's also called this period of the 100 schools of philosophy. So Confucius was not the only philosopher operating at this time. Confucius's main goal was to try and to retrieve and implement the values of the Zhou culture that it had during its glory days, as he saw it. And he spent his life unsuccessfully looking for permanent employment as a minister to a ruler whom he could advise. That by minister, I mean a civil servant in the government, basically an advisor to a ruler. So you had these warring states, and so he went from state to state looking for someone in whose court he could serve. And oftentimes although he was respected, oftentimes he wouldn't be amenable or acceptable to the rulers because Confucius had very high moral standards for rulers, and people didn't always want to abide by that. So he never found permanent employment. The Analects is a collection of sayings by and about Confucius recorded by his disciples. Now, let me introduce you to some of the key terms or ideas of Confucianism. There's a term, ren, which is typically translated benevolence, and this means compassion or sympathy for others. You'll also see this translated as humanity, or as in the sense of humaneness, a humane person. And unfortunately, in the translation which I've given you for class, this is sometimes translated as virtue, and that can be misleading in a number of ways, as I'll discuss later. Another key term here is yi, and this is translated rightness or righteousness. It means the integrity of a person who disdains to demean himself by doing what is shameful and base, even if doing so would reap benefits. Then there's shi, which is translated wisdom. This means being a good judge of the character of others, skill at means and reasoning, that is figuring out what you have to do to achieve a certain goal, and understanding of and commitment to other virtues and prudence in general. And then fourthly, there's propriety, li, and this is the virtue that consists in performing the rites with the proper motivations. Now, this is also probably the central Confucian idea that is most foreign, perhaps, to Americans. So li consists in it's the performance of rights. And by rights, we don't mean the right to bear arms or natural rights like that. We mean rituals. Li includes customs, ceremonies, traditions of proper behavior that in Confucius's time covered all aspects of life. It also included sacrifices to ancestors. Ancestor worship was an important part of that culture, and to other gods as well. And this is very important for Confucius and Confucianism. Now, the person who exemplifies all these virtues, especially humaneness and wisdom, is called junzi, gentleman is the way it's translated. So that's really one of your ideal figures that in Confucianism one is aspiring to be. Now, there's other kinds or categories of people that you might aspire to be. You might aspire to be a sage, which is even kind of higher than that. It's not even clear that Confucius himself is a sage. You'll also see this word junzi translated as a superior person, in our version that we're reading, or a person of complete virtue. And they're contrasted with a small person or a mean person. Another crucial concept for Confucianism is this term "zhao," which means filial piety or filiality. Now, filial has to do with sons and parents, and so this is the virtue of honoring one's parents, and it's absolutely crucial for the Confucian worldview and in Chinese culture generally. We'll say more about that in a second. Another theme running through the Analects and through the Mencius as well is this theme of learning, of study. And you might wonder, when Confucius talks about the value or the importance of study and of learning, what is he talking about? What are you learning? Like, what's the literature or the subjects that are being studied in this case? And for him, this includes learning the right ways to do rituals. And he learns that from ancient documents that he did a lot of research on in his travels as he went from state to state, looking at different court archives. And also it means studying the poetry of the odes, which is a classic text of Chinese literature. All right, so those are some basic ideas that you'll see, themes you'll see emerging in all sorts of ways in this text, in these texts. Now, in Confucianism, there are 5 key relationships which really structure our duties and virtues. So there's the relationship between the son and the father. And on the one side, the son is to exemplify filial piety, and the father is to set an example and be benevolent. There's the minister and the ruler, the relationship between the minister, that is the civil servant, and the ruler. And on the one hand, the minister is to be obedient, and the ruler is supposed to exemplify righteousness. And I think that goes as well for the relationship between subjects and rulers, not just ministers, but the people in general and the rulers. Confucius has a lot to say about that. And you can see why, because again, he and his disciples are trying to be state advisors. And so they care a lot about the right way to govern and the right way the people should relate to their ruler. There's the relationship between the wife and the husband, and the wife is to exemplify obedience, and the husband, faithful dominance. The relationship between the young and the old in general, not just parents, but all young people and their elders. The young are to show respect. The old are to set a precedent, a good example. And there's also the relationship between friends who are to display mutuality and trust towards one another. Again, a theme that emerges again and again in these texts. So as you turn to the Analects, I think you might find it to be a different kind of text than the other philosophical texts that we studied in this class. And you might even wonder, what genre am I reading here? I think one way you could think of the Analects is its genre is wisdom literature. So if you're familiar with Hebrew and Christian scriptures, you might think of the book of Proverbs, where there are a lot of aphorisms or sayings about general principles or maxims about the way to live. Is it a philosophical text? That's a good question. On the one hand, you're not going to find extended arguments in the Analects like you might in, say, Descartes' Meditations or other Western texts. On the other hand, there is a philosophy in the book. That is, there's an interlocking set of ideas. They include ideas about morality, about society and politics. So in that broad sense, it is a philosophical text. You might wonder whether it's a religious text. After all, Confucianism is a system that you will study in religion class as well. So is it religious? Well, there are references to heaven, to spirits of the dead, to ritual sacrifices, and to other kinds of ceremonies which you might think of as religious. But on the other hand, Confucius isn't claiming to be a prophet. He's not making these assertions on the basis of divine revelation as if God told him. So in that sense, it goes against some of your expectations of what a religious text would be. But it's not important to me to litigate whether it counts as philosophy or it counts as religion or both or neither. The point is, it's an interesting text that we can look at as philosophers fruitfully. So if there aren't arguments in this text, per se, that of the standard sort that we might find in other philosophy texts, and if it's not being justified by an appeal to divine authority, then why should we believe anything that Confucius is saying? Like, what's the justification for the claims here? And I think, this is just Sasser as a newcomer to this in many ways, I think there's a few things that the authors might say. They might just say, look, these sayings, they ring true. They just have this intuitive force and plausibility. There's just this kind of immediate depth to them. You might say that, hey, you can also examine the internal coherence of these ideas. They fit together, they lock together. They give us an extensive and systematic view of human life. And that might be some sort of justification for them. You might say they've come from this guy, Confucius, who lived a great life just by following these rules. And so, look, if you want to live a good life, follow his example by following these sayings. And then you might say, well, we can test them against our own lived experience of the world. Is this the way the world works? Is this the way life works? Is this the way people are? I think these are all legitimate ways that you might critically test these claims, and ways that a Confucian might say they can be confirmed. Okay, but I leave that to you to determine whether they do or not. Now, I just want to look a little bit more closely at some of these key claims and ideas, these themes that emerge from the Analects in particular, because they raise, I think, interesting questions that challenge us, especially as from an American perspective, common assumptions that we have as Americans. One is this idea of filial piety. What does it mean? Why is it important? Well, for Confucius, filial piety is really the root of your character as a person. The Analects 1:2 says this: the superior man bends his attention to what is radical. Now, the word radical has to do with roots, like going to the roots of things. So the superior man wants to look at the fundamentals, the radical part of his character. That being established, all practical courses, that is the way, the Tao, the way of life, naturally grow up from these fundamental issues. Filial piety and fraternal submission, are they not the root of all benevolent actions? And it's a rhetorical question. The idea is yes. Filial piety and fraternal submission are the root of all benevolent actions by humans. What does that include? What does it mean to be filial? Well, it brings with it obligations that we have to our parents while they're alive. We owe them obedience, respect, even service with the utmost strength that we have, the Analects stress in many places. Furthermore, we have obligations to our parents after their death. In the first place, we have an obligation to perform the proper funeral rites for them and to continue offering perpetual sacrifices to them. Remember, ancestor worship is an important part of this culture. And to maintain the father's ways even after he is no longer there to check on you. And we're obligated to be essentially filial piety is also essentially connected to our respect and submission to all elders, to all rulers in general. So again, it's got this radical significance. And I think there's a lot of questions that this concept of filial piety raises for us. I mean, what do you think are the duties of juvenile children and of adult children towards their living parents or towards their deceased parents? And what connection does it have really to our character more generally? What about this concept of the gentleman? Well, unlike the small man who thinks only of his own interests and comfort, the gentleman thinks only of benevolence, the good of all, and of righteousness. The gentleman values personal character and integrity rather than social recognition. And you can see this exemplified really in Kongzi's own career. The very first passage in the Analects says this: "Is he not a man of complete virtue, who feels no discomposure, though men may take no note of him?" There's a kind of humility here, a concern with uh, having personal integrity, regardless of whether that's recognized or not. The master said, "A man should say, I am not concerned that I have no place. I am not concerned how I may fit myself. No, sorry, I am concerned how I may fit myself for one. I am not concerned that I am not known. I seek to be worthy to be known." That's what matters for Confucius. The gentleman practices self-denial, even in his eating and in his seeking after the comforts of life. The gentleman is very careful in his words, discreet and sincere, and earnest in his deeds. His words match his actions. And you can see how for someone who seeks to be a government official who's advising a ruler, this is particularly important. Your words, your sincerity, and your personal integrity. And he loves to learn from other gentlemen. Again, there's a kind of humility here, a love of learning and a willingness to learn from anybody who can teach him to be better. Now, one of Kongzi's most important followers came a couple generations later, and his name was Mengzi, or more commonly known as Mencius. That's the Latinized version. He's known by in the West. And he lives a couple generations later, near the beginning of the Warring States period. I've given you just a very brief excerpt from Mengzi, and this contains one of his more famous passages where he asserts a certain view of human nature. Mencius thinks that human nature is essentially good. Humans are born good. And he says that human nature contains 4 sprouts. He's using this plant metaphor to describe the way human beings are. These 4 sprouts are natural feelings that we have, that we're just born having. And if they're cultivated appropriately, we are brought up naturally, those are going to develop into the 4 key virtues of Confucianism. So our natural feeling of pity or compassion blossoms into humaneness, benevolence, ren. Our natural feelings of shame and aversion blossom into rightness. Our natural feeling of modesty and compliance develop into propriety. And our natural sense of the right and wrong thing to do becomes wisdom. Now, things can go wrong. These sprouts may not be properly cultivated, and they might not grow up into the full virtues, but we're born with all those sprouts in us, according to Mencius. Confucianism has been enormously influential on Chinese culture for millennia. It was the basis of the civil service exams that government officials had to pass up until 1911. But beginning in the 19th century, and especially then into the 20th, there was the confrontation with the modern West produced tensions in Chinese culture, and Confucian values came into tension with values of science, democracy, and modernity. And so there was more debate and discussion about the legacy of Confucianism in modern China. But the real big shift came when Mao Zedong led the communists to take control of China in 1949. The civil war that he'd been part of, been running for 22 years, but he gained control in 1949. Of course, Marxism is another Western philosophy that was not native to China, but which was then disseminated through the Chinese Communist Party, and is really at odds in many ways with Confucianism, especially with its hierarchical conservative bent. During the Cultural Revolution that Mao led from 1966 to 1976, all sorts of old traditional institutions were under attack, but a specific phase of that from 73 to 76 was directly anti-Confucian. So the Chinese Communist Party, tried to purge Confucianism out of Chinese culture. Now, after the death of Mao and the end of the Cultural Revolution, there's been a gradual rehabilitation of Confucius's reputation in recent decades. However, it's fairly eclectic, and by eclectic I mean that there's a number of different ways that people are appropriating, using, responding to, and interpreting the Confucian legacy. It's not all hardline Confucianism like it was historically. But Confucius is especially being used for political purposes as a sort of as a poster child for Chinese culture more broadly. More could be said about that, but I'll just leave it there and say Confucianism is one of the massively influential world cultural systems, and it certainly merits our time, attention, and thoughtful consideration.